Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1256. The first few lines in the second paragraph, the new paragraph. So as I elaborated on yesterday, and I'm not going to do that again now, the Rebbe Rashab is making all the connections, the technical and the Kabbalistic connections between what we've been discussing in the process of the growth of emotions, which is essentially represented by the growth of Gan Eden, the trees of Havaya. We're talking about the level of Havaya, which is either Zoh or Chochmah, but the outer dimension of Chochmah. So it's how the intellect still relates to the emotions. And now what we connected with was the pasuk that says, Vayitav Havaya Elokim, that God planted Havaya Elokim. So it's referring to the yichud of Havaya and Elokim in the three levels of the unifications we spoke about. Daughter, sister, mother. The yichud of Havaya Adnai is the daughter. Of Havaya Elokim is the sister, what he's discussing here, where Malchus elevates to the same level as Zoh, as Midas, and Imi would be the Yichud of Havaya Eya that he discussed earlier on page 1254. So now, which is where it's higher than Midas and Zoh. So it's a Yichud Havaya Elokim. Melikim is Malchus as it is in Atzilus, and is the Yichud of Malchus with Zoh. So Zoh and Malchus are united in the beginning parts of Batzilus, and it stands across Neged Chagaz de Zoh. So now that Malchus is below and Zoh is above, Mashpia Mekabel, but Malchus stands side by side. Beginning Yichud Ponim Beponim, face to face, as I explained, in a unity, in a union, and he cited from Eitz Chaim Shar HaZevugim this level of Yichud. Now, it's not the highest level of Yichud, but it's higher than when Malchus is on a lower level. Now, in the parentheses that we're going to learn now, he's going to refer back to something we learned all the way in the beginning of this volume, if you recall. You go back to page 1208 and 1209, he spoke about the moon and the sun, that there are 7 different levels of Malchus, the Aliyah of Malchus, and the way this moon and the sun relate to each other. So I actually went to Eitz Chaim to really spell out what the 7 are, and it's quite fascinating. This is Shar Miyut HaYereach, as he refers to chapter 1. And so chapter 1 and chapter 2, he discusses this at length, the 7 levels of Aliyas HaMalchus, and even more fascinating in chapter 2 there, he goes through all of history, from Adam and Chava in the Garden of Eden, through the patriarchs, the Ovis, through Matan Torah, through the Beis Hamikdash, all through history, how those 7 levels manifested in different stages in history. As a matter of fact, I thought of it, I had a brainstorm, which I always wanted to do, but maybe now is a good time to think about it. Maybe if any of you perhaps are interested, maybe you can partner with me in this and we could do it together. I wanted to learn this Eitz Chaim more in detail on its own, separate from this class, and really go through it and document it. And I think we could actually create a map, literally like a map of the psyche or of the cosmic order, based on Ayin Beis' explanation of the Midas growth. We can really map it out and see different stages of maturity and growth, as well as how it's reflected in the Aliyah of Malchus, as well as how it's reflected in history. So you can come away with a very rich a type of visual rendition, like animated even, that can really bring it alive as a real map for education, for children, for adults. So that's why I had this brainstorm last night to do that once I was reading the Eitz Chaim. And as you read it, you see how much Ayin Beis is so interwoven and intertwined with these 7 levels. Now, the Rebbe Rashab did not spell out, and he's not going to spell out all the 7, but I think for context purposes, I will do that right now and because it'll help us understand the parentheses we're going to read now. So I actually wrote it down. I went and I actually and found the 7 levels in Eitz Chaim with the Rebbe Rashab. If you see in this paragraph, he's going to say Shezeo Hamadrega Hagimel Shebchinis Panim B'Panim, and here's how he structures it. So I'm going to tell you the 7 levels, which also, as I said, refer back to the beginning of this volume. And actually, in this beginning of the volume, he even counted an 8th one, which is the ultimate level. And he even explained on the bottom of page 1209 why the Eitz Chaim doesn't count this 8th level. Okay, but I'll explain that now, and I see it's all coming together in the context of Ein Oid and so on. So basically the 7 levels of Aliyas HaMalchus. So we talked about 3. We talked about daughter being a makabel from Zah. We talked about a chesi being equal to Zah, like the Tanoim and Amoraim, as they learn Torah and they paskin halachas and they evaluate and analyze Torah. And then we talked about Biti, the neshamas that are higher than Torah, that mashpia into Torah. So those 3 levels are Malchus. They're all the daughter of the king, as the Medrash says, that he continued to love his daughter to the point first he called her daughter, then sister, then mother. So he explained these are 3 levels of elevation of Malchus. Now, in Eitz Chaim, he breaks it down into 7 levels. That's not a contradiction to these 3, as you'll see in a moment. Basically, he divides it into 3 and 4, 7. The first lower levels are a yichud of acher ba'acher. Remember, we spoke yesterday that the yichud could be face-to-face or back-to-back. In the early levels of infancy of Malchus, think of it like a student or a makabel, it can't stand face-to-face with its teacher because they're too far apart. So they're basically back-to-back, which is just symbolic of that the flow is is more of a minimal flow. Basically coming from the back, not from the front. Like when we say Hashem spoke to Moshe face-to-face. Doesn't mean physically face-to-face. It means with a full gilui of God's pnimius, ponim. When you speak from the back, you're like when Hashem says to Moshe, you can't see my face and live, but you can see my back. What does it mean as back? That you can see a reflection of me. So to speak, a lower dimension of my expression. Essentially like a teacher only showing the surface, the tip of the iceberg, if you wish, to his student, because the student cannot yet contain more. So the first 3 categories the Eitz Chaim counts are all acher ba'acher, which means the yichud of Keser, of Malchus, is all still with Zah, more from the back end, not from the front end, meaning it's a diminished type of flow, a minimal flow. And I'm actually reading from the Eitz Chaim. It says level number 1, from the bottom up. Tachlis hamiyut, utter diminishment, and it's like the new moon, think of it. There's almost nothing there. Like we say, les lamagama klum, it has nothing of its own. It's not a full moon, because a full moon is already facing the sun face to face. And that's why you see the full glow of the moon, of the sun through the moon. That's why it's a full moon. That's considered the 15th day of the month. But the first day of the month, like Tikka B'Chodesh Shefer, is you don't see anything. It's a speck. It's the birth. So he calls it, the Malchus is Tachlis Hamiyut, Nukuda. It's a Nukuda, Kalula Miyud. In it, you have all the 10 spheres, but they're all in a completely concentrated, like in one cell, a concentrated point. Not the point of Chachma, which is the beginning of the process. We're talking about the end of the process. So Malchus, in its first step, is this Nukuda. Ein lo partsuf. It does not have a structure. A medes lamata mahayesod shalei. So it stands below Yesod, which is already the last level of Zah. Remember, Zah is Chesed Gvur Teferes Netzach Chod Yesod. So Malchus stands beneath it. That's level number 1. Now, I just want to give a summary of this. I don't want to analyze it too much, because it's not what he's saying here. It's just going to help context. Level number 2 in this category of 3, the 3 lower levels, which are all acher ba'acher, as he says there. Here, in level 2, Malchus gets more revelation. Think of it like the moon is beginning to shine a little more. Or as we spoke about, when we spoke about the Midas, or Malchus, about that's starting to develop more. So it says Partsuf Gomer B'Yud Sfiris. Now Malchus, before we said it's not a Partsuf, it didn't have structure, just a point. Now it's a Partsuf Gomer. Elo Shashir Kemosa Ba'acher Zo Mechazeu Lamata. But its height, it's now no longer just completely a Nakuda. It does have some height, so to speak, some Gilui, but it's Shir Kemosa, which means the measure of its height is the back of Za, Mechazei Lamata, from its chest down. Now let me just explain what that means. Remember, everything is structured like the human body is reflective of the spheres. So every sphere, generally speaking, we have three parts of the body: the head, Reish, Guf, Regel. The head, the body, Guf, and Regel is the legs. So if you talk about the full spheres, you have all three levels. When you say something, it only connects to the Chazei Lamata, you're saying it only connects to Za and the lower levels of Za and below. Because Za itself consists of Netzach, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes. That's Lamay Lama Chazei. That's like where the heart is. Then you talk about the three next spheres as Netzach, Ched, Yesod. So now he's saying Malchus is no longer just a Nakuda below Yesod. It's already has some stature, but it's still the back of Za, and only from the chest down. But the Eiris that exist in the five higher levels of Za, which is Keser, Chachma, Bina, Chesed, Gvura, Lo Ye'iru B'Dalet Tachteina Shebei. They don't radiate in the four lower levels. So the five higher don't radiate in the four lower, which is where now Malchus has reached the Chazei, which is basically that's here it looks like Teferes, Netzach, Ched, and Yesod. So that's level number 2. Level number 3 of Malchus's elevation. So he says this language: Now Malchus is receiving not just from the four lower, Teferes, Netzach, Ched, Yesod, but also from Keser, Chachma, Bina, and Chesed Gvura, the five higher ones. However, and it grows accordingly. But it's still all from the back end, not from the front end. So it's grown. It's like the student isn't just receiving a Aleph Beis, they're receiving more, but they're still receiving level 2, level 3, even more, but it's still from the back of the teacher, not from the front, meaning from more of a reflection than the very core. Then come the next 4 levels. These are all panim b'panim. Now Malchus elevates, we're starting to look at the face of its teacher. You know, it says in the Gemara about that when Rabbi Meir was learning, when the student was looking, he wanted to see Rabbi Meir's face because it helps him appreciate the understanding. But sometimes, like people stood by Fabrenga, they didn't see the Rebbe's face. They just heard his words. But seeing a face always illuminates more. The face, that your eyes should see the face of the teacher. So now the 4 higher levels, Malchus is beginning now to see the face of Za. And here too are 4 levels, which will finally lead to I'll explain in a moment. So level number 4, which really is the second group. After the lower 30 levels, there's now the higher 4 levels. The lowest of the 4, which is level 4, is Shetia Partsu Shalom Panim B'Panim. That it should have a complete face, not just the back of the face, meaning just seeing the back, but also the face to face. However, but now it's also from the chest down, but now face to face from the chest down. So it's a lower level than the higher 5 spheres, but it's now the face of them, as opposed to the back. But the 5 higher are not there, only from the chest down. So Malchus is now in Nakuda. It encompasses all 10, but it's standing now with Yesod face to face, not back to back. And Yesod, of course, is the bottom of the 4 lower levels, 4 lower spheres, I should say. Level number 5, next elevation. Now the Heiras Shenis of Zah are radiating in Malchus, ponim b'ponim, but it's still only the Chazei Lamata. It's only in the chest and below. So level 4 is ponim b'ponim, but only lower than the chest. And now it's higher than the chest, but it's ponim b'ponim. And it goes down to Netzach. And Malchus connects with this level. Okay. But it's still, Malchus is still lower, obviously, because Zah has to bend down to Malchus, because Chazei, the connection is only to the chest, meaning it's like, let's think of a child that a parent has to bend down to. Because, so it's panim b'panim, but it's only chest, and it's all, and now we're talking the Heiras Shenis. Level number 6, he says, Shatig deli kameyu, shir kemose panim b'panim. Now Malchus has arrived at the same level as Zah. It's no longer just the chest down, it's face to face, equal height. And it receives the 5 higher levels face to face. So then why is it still level 6, not the highest? So he says, even though it's now standing on the same level Zah, but the moichin that are higher than Zah are still traveling through Zah. And that's why the Kesed of Zah is higher than the Kesed of Malchus. So it'd be like a king and queen standing side by side, but the king's crown is still higher than the queen's crown. But it's no longer the chest or lower levels, it's face to face, but there's still something that Malchus is getting its power from Zah. That's what he says is level number 6. Just a minute, I'm just reading. Okay. And finally, level number 7. He says, Shetiya gamhi mishameshes b'keser echad. Now the moon and the sun are no longer 2 entities. They are both using the same keser. Remember, the complaint of the moon was that you can't have one king with 2 crowns. And the answer is yes, you can. And that ultimately the Levana and the Shemesh now are equal, literally equal, that they're both receiving from one keser. So, and they're both receiving from Ima, from Bina, from the mother. And they stand, as I said, side by side, same stature. And this is called Tachlis Hagidul Shalah. This is the ultimate growth of Malchus, the 7th level. But here, on page 1205, the Rebbe Rashab said, 1209. If you look at the bottom of 1209, he said there's one more level. Malchus goes higher than Zah. Here, Malchus and Zah, sun and moon are equal. But then there's a level where he says that the darkness itself illuminates, and he says, Malchus Atzma Teir, those are Malchus L'mayla Mahazah, Umashpia B'Zah. So now Malchus is on the level of Bina. This is not counted in the 7 levels. The 7 levels stop where Malchus and Zah are equally receiving from the mother. And the Rebbe Rashab says, I'm reading 3 lines from the bottom of 1209. It says, Zeu be'emes ischachus davar. This is actually a truly new thing. The 7 levels we just discussed existed, or at least in some part they existed in Ishtalshlus. Even before the Tzimtzum. The Yeshlema, the Rebbe Rashab says, the Lechein Eina Cheshev Beitz Chaim. That's why the Eitz Chaim does not count this level. Madrei Gezu, Ba'aliyas HaMalchus, Mipnei Shezeu Ischachus Gemura B'chlol Seishtalshlus. Because it's a completely new level. The Eitz Chaim is only talking about Ishtalshlus. In Ishtalshlus, there's the 7 levels. And this new level, which we're talking about, the Ir Chadash, where Malchus goes to that level of height, of Biti, of Imi, that is not mentioned in Eitz Chaim. Now, there's still discussion about, if you look on top of the page, I don't want to go through all the details here right now, but if you look at the higher levels, the top of the page, you'll see the seventh level he spells out. And he discusses, doesn't it say in Eitz Chaim that will also not be till Asad Love Mashiach comes, and he explains and answers that question on top of the page. He basically says that that there's still some form of Mlachus. Okay, these are the 7 levels. And now we can understand the parentheses. Now you see the connection to the 7 level very clearly to what we've been discussing. We've been talking about the elevation of Malchus and Midas as they climb, as they grow. Here we're talking about specifically Malchus. So he doesn't speak about 7, but I did say yesterday that there's around 7 or 8 levels that I've enumerated here that I can imagine, that I can calculate that are about this whole elevation. So now that's how it's spelled out in Eitz Chaim. And Ayin Beis, he's not going to spell out all 7. He talks mostly about the 3 that we're talking about: daughter, sister, mother. But the level of sister is now going to establish which level of the 7 levels of Eitz Chaim is it. And the Rebbe Rashab is going to say a chiddush on this. So now the parentheses. So after saying a line before that we're talking about Malchus is standing neged chagaz dezah, ponim b'ponim, face to face. Well, what level is it? We said before, face to face has 4 levels. There's the face to face that is just lower than the chest, but only the 4 lower spheres. There's lower than the chest, but also the 5 higher spheres. Then there's above the chest, but they're still receiving, Malchus is still receiving through Zah. And then there's Malchus completely equal with Zah. So which level of those 4 are we talking about here? Ponim b'ponim. So he says, the one I just read more in detail. Look in that Eitz Chaim in chapter 1 of Miyut HaYereach, the diminishment of the moon. V'nira, this is the Rebbe Rashab is saying, and perhaps v'nira, it seems. V'nira means I feel. He doesn't say I, but v'nira means it seems, it appears. Shezeu hamadrega hagimel, that this is the 3rd level shebebchinas ponim b'ponim. In other words, it's the 4th level of going from the top down, bottom up. In ponim b'ponim is the 3rd level. What is that level? Umekabeles gam b'chinas Chabad, that it's face to face and it's receiving also from Chabad. Rakakol al yedei hazah, but it's still all going through Zah. So he's talking that this is the 3rd level shebchinas ponim b'ponim. So it's receiving from Chabad, but it's going through Zah. Let me just see, what level was that? The truth is, if my reading of Eitz Chaim is correct, that looks like level 6, not level 4. But let me see something. Anyway, regardless, then he says, "V'ayim asher kosav v'peirik daled," and look what it says in Eitz Chaim in chapter 4, "V'adayin tzarechiyun," and it still needs iyun, it still needs delving into, which means it's not clear. So I didn't look in chapter 4 yet. I have to look in chapter 4. I will say what he calls level 3 here, seems to me it's level 6. So maybe he means level 3 from the bottom up. That's probably what he means. Yeah. In other words, when you go from the bottom up, you have the 3 lower, which we're not discussing. Then come the 4 higher. The 3rd one from the bottom of the 4 higher is the 6th level from the bottom up. I think that's what he means, Madrega Hagimel. Yeah. Because in Eitz Chaim, he divides it. He doesn't say it. He says there's 7 levels, but he divides them. First, he goes 1, 2, 3 in the bottom ones. Then he goes 4, 5, 6, 7, but he counts it 1, 2, 3, 4 in the top ones. So Madrega Gimel is the language used in Eitz Chaim, which is technically is the 6th level if you count them, all 7 of them. So it's the next to the highest level, basically. So he says that is Gan Eden on its own without avodah, because it's Yichud Havaya and Elokim. Malchus is uniting with Zah. and they're face to face and the same stature, but it's still receiving chachma through zah, not directly. So therefore, it's not the ultimate level where the moon and the sun are literally equal, or Malchus and Zah are equal, receiving from Moichin, from Chabad directly. Now, what it says in chapter 4 in the Tzarechim, I need to look into, and I'll keep you posted. Okay, so that's the parentheses with my elaboration. I'll stop here if anybody wants to ask anything. A very interesting subject, as we can tell. And literally, I would say, you can even phase out the month of the year in the phases of the moon, that you can also spell these out. Like as in the new moon would be level 1, and the full moon, even though today the full moon is still reflecting the sun, it's not really equal, but relatively speaking, it definitely is in a state where it's face to face with the sun, and it's giving us the full glow. But it's not quite as it will be La'asad Lavi, when the moon will be as strong as the sun, or even stronger. But still, in a more nuanced way, in a more microcosmic way, you probably can identify the 7 levels also during the lunar cycle. You know, the new moon, the full moon, there's the first quarter, the second quarter, that's 4. And then in between. I'd have to look a little more into it. And as I said earlier, in chapter 2 in Eitz Chaim, he actually spells out how these 7 levels manifest throughout history, from the beginning of creation all the way through, not to our time, but also Golus and so on. And it's interesting how he structures that, but that requires its own study. So any questions?
When it said that in Eitz Chaim that the 7th level, the highest level, was when Malchus is face to face with Zah, I was wondering, why wouldn't you want to go higher to Chabad and the 8th level? Because I think the 4 lower levels was Acher La'acher, you had to go up all the way to Kachab, you said. So I was wondering why in the last level.
Who says you don't?
Now he says it here, and in Ayin Beis he says it is Chabad through Zah.
That's level 6. That's not level 7.
That's not 7?
That's 6.
So Zah wasn't, in the Eitz Chaim, the last level wasn't it receiving face to face with Zah? Wasn't that the 7th level?
And they're receiving straight from Chabad directly, both of them. That's what he said. Directly
from Chabad, which is not Zah. You mean higher?
They stand together, but they both receive equally from Chabad. From
you mean Malchus is Yichud with Zah and they're facing Chabad?
And they're receiving Chabad. They're standing united and receiving Chabad equally.
It's fine. And then
that's
the 7th level.
Yeah. And there is an 8th level where Malchus actually becomes Bina. That's what I said. I mentioned bottom of 1209. Yes. He talks about an 8th. He doesn't say it's not part of Eitz Chaim, but there's another level where Malchus actually becomes Bina, higher than Zah. Which we've been learning at length here, what that means. That's Bina, and so on.
Right,
so
even. The level even.
In Ayin Beis, besides the 7 levels, he's been talking at length about the highest level that comes from B'chol Moedecha, where we actually draw from Atik and from Arich and Atik and higher levels, Atzmi is Bina, which is even higher than regular Bina. And that's Mashpia into Zah, like the Neshamas that are Mashpia into Torah. Yeah. I suggest listening to it again and going through it. It's a little dense and not that simple. But I laid out the whole map here pretty clearly, I believe. As I said, to really appreciate it, I would go back to earlier pages so you see how it all comes together. I'm speaking here as a summation of everything we've been learning about the elevation all the way up to the highest levels of Mutva Murgish Muskel, where you're talking about Sichlim, Sichlim, and then all the way to Ava B'chol Me'edecha, and with the mind, the Atzmius of Bina and Chochmah, as they receive from Arich and Atik. That, of course, is the highest level where you have a Chassidus and something completely new. What we're talking about is not new. This is all within Seder Shtalshlus. It's higher levels, but it's in Seder Shtalshlus. This is still within Gan Eden as God planted it, Havaya Elokim. Okay.
Do you think
Any
that
other questions?
do you think that the reason that the Arizal didn't mention this highest level at that time, where what's the Rabbi Rashab brings it now as nearer this level, is because it was before Chabad Chassidus?
No,
and
the
that
Rebbe Rashab, I just read inside. He tells us why he doesn't mention it. Look at the bottom of page 1209. He says, yes, Shleimer, why the Eitz Chaim doesn't mention it. Rebbe Rashab himself answers that. He says, because it's higher, it's Aliyas HaMalchus, because it's Chachus Gemura, B'chlol Seishtalshus. The last line on page 1209. Just read that. He asked the question, he answers it. Why the result didn't count it. Now you could bring about what that means, but that's what he says. He says because it's outside of the Seder Shtalshus, and it's the Chiddush, so that's why it's not counted in the 7. The 7, he's talking the structure of Seder Shtalshus. Basically, not what's coming through the real ultimate Avodah that we're going to learn about soon. Okay. So now he continues after, any other questions? So he continues after the parentheses and says, remember, we're talking about Vayita, Havaya Elokim. The Havaya and Elokim is Malchus in Atzilus, uniting with Zoh, which is the Yichud Havaya and Elokim, and he identified it being the 6th level, the Yichud of Ponim B'Ponim, Chagas, that it stands across Chagas of Zoh, and he said that's probably the 6th level. Umeir Gili Shem Havaya b'Shem Elokim. That means Yichud Havaya and Elokim. That Shem Havaya, the higher name, the higher revelation, is radiating in Elokim. When we spoke about the other creations, it only says Vayemer Elokim. Elokim said, Yehi Oyer, Yehi Rakia. There you only have Elokus in the form of Tzimtzum. But in Gan Eden, what he planted in Gan Eden was Havaya radiating into Elokim, and that is essentially the level that he's discussing here. Okay. Now, this is, I have to always make sure we don't get confused. Remember, Havaya itself, we've been learning 2 interpretations in Havaya. Havaya is it's in Zoh and radiating into Malchus, and they're equal, like we're talking here. And then remember, Havaya, when he spoke about Havaya b'Chochma, there's also Havaya's Chochma, and then Elokim is Bina. So he's been speaking these 2 tracks all the time, Zoh and Malchus, and Chochma and Bina. When he spoke about Eitzah Havaya, he said Havaya is their Chochma, and there's the Eitzah of how to be Mamshech, the Yud, through Yud Kei Vav, the order, the advice and counsel necessary. So now he's going back and saying, what we just said, Vayita Havaya Elokim, regarding Zoh and Malchus, also applies to Chochma and Bina. Ukamoikeinu beyichud Abba ve'ima, and the same is on a higher level of a yichud. And we discussed this last week at length. What's the difference between the unity, the union of father and mother that gives birth to Zoh and Malchus, and the unity of Zoh and Malchus? Essentially, Zoh and Malchus is where the real creation of Bria happens. But in Atzilus itself, there's a birth, and that's the birth of emotions that come from Chochma and Bina. So he says now like this. Now, the Yichud Chochma and Bina, Abba ve'ima, the Havaya b'Chochma, Ubina Hishem Elokim. So the same thing is when you say Vayita Havaya Elokim, that Havaya Elokim planted Gan Eden. So it also refers to Chochma and Bina, the Yichud. So he's going to explain here as well that it's higher. Now this union, both of Zoh and Malchus and of Chochma and Bina, is higher than Havaya Adnai. As a matter of fact, I think the Vahari Zeh is referring more to Zoh and Malchus than to Chochma and Bina. So the Rebbe Rashab now added that in Chochma and Bina you also have this union, but keep in mind that this is Yichud Chitzeni. It's not Yichud Primi, like he said at the end of last paragraph. It's the Moichin as it relates to Zoh. It's Chitzenius of Chochma, not Primius of Chochma, because we're not talking yet that which is achieved through Avodah. We're talking about how God planted the garden, so it's higher than the rest of the world, or the rest of the worlds, but it's still not the highest. It's level 6. Now he's going to say, so what is it higher? So what's unique about it? How is Havaya Elokim unique? Because it's higher then remember the yichud. The first yichud was what? The daughter is the yichud of Havaya and Adnai. And as I explained then, Adnai is Malchus, but not Malchus as it's an Atzilus. He's going to say two ways to explain Havaya Adnai. So who lamaila? That is a lamaila ma'yichud the Havaya Adnai. That's Biti. That's the daughter, as he said on page 1254. Is it 1254? 1 second. No, 1249. Sorry, on 1249. So he says it's higher than Havaya Adnai. Why? The Yesh Lemer, because Havaya Adnai, you can say, we learned in volume 2 that even though Elokim and Adnai are sometimes synonymous, they both refer to Malchus, but generally Elokim is Malchus and Atzilus, and Adnai is how Malchus goes down into Bria. So Havaya Adnai is also the Gili of Havaya, but it's how Havaya going down already into the next world, into the next level dimension called Bria or Biyah. So he says the Yesh Lemer, and he's going to say two ways. That when you talk about Havaya Adnai, Shezeu, Kamoisha Oris HaKav, that's how the reflection of the Kav, the original thin line, the Kav Chut, the line, the thread of stream of energy that comes after the Tzimtzum, Boka Esa Parsa, pierces the partition between Atzilus and Bria. Imakelim the Malchus the Atzilus. So it says in Ageres HaKedah Siman Chaf, which is what he's quoting here, without saying the source, that let me explain it for a moment. The Kav, we know, is the main instrument that God uses, like a laser beam that comes after the Tzimtzum concealed, then v'chazer v'hayir, he then, like this teacher, was silent, complete silence, complete stopping any transmission, and then the teacher begins a flow that's laser beam tailored and focused, not everywhere scattered. It's a kav. It's a line, a thread, literally like a laser beam that will create everything in the cholol, in the space left after the tzimtzum. Now, there's a long discussion in Kabbalah, Chassidus especially, how far does the kav go? We know the kav is going to be basically, think of it like the I don't want to call it like the sun, but it's like a sun. It's like a beam of energy, but it doesn't. But at some point the kav stops, and all we have afterwards is a reflection of the kav. So you'll find in Chassidus talking about that the kav usually stops around at the end of Atzilus, the Sod Atzilus. There's different levels, but basically in Atzilus. After Atzilus, the kav stops its original flow, and from there on, it's a reflection of the kav. It still reflects all the way down to Asiya, because we wouldn't have existence if there was no kav. But it's not the original kav; it's a reflection of the kav. It's like the sunlight coming from the kav, so to speak. So in the Ageres HaKedah, she says that when the kav concludes, it's light, its reflection pierces the partition, because in order to go from Atzilus to Bria, which is a paradigm shift, it's not as powerful as the paradigm shift of the first Tzimtzum, but it has similarities. We discussed this at length in volume 2, because a parsa is necessary, because as long as you have the intensity of Atzilus, you can't have a world that's called Yesh, Bria, Yesh Ma'ayin. Even though it's a holy Yesh, it's completely dedicated to godliness, but it now has its own independent identity. In Atzilus, the Oves, Heinhen and Merkava, are a chariot that have no will of their own. They're completely a chariot, a channel of godliness. In Bria, you have 10 spheres, and they are all holy spheres, but they're now so-called entities that have some consciousness of their own. And that's going to be the beginning. In Yitzira, it becomes the consciousness more Yesh, in Asiya more, all the way to Asiya Gashmis and Churmis, our world, where the Yesh is dominant and we don't really, and the Ur is far more difficult to access. So as Atzilus goes to Asiya, the energy gets weaker and the Kalim gets stronger. So Bria is a place where the Kav, the Ha'aris HaKav, pierces the partition, so something comes through, but now it's through a partition, like a curtain, so it's not quite that same intense light. And the language that he uses, that it pierces the pasa ima kalim the Malchus Atzilus, because the kalim of Malchus of Atzilus also come downward, because the kelim of Malchus of Atzilus will become the heir of the Nefesh Ruach Neshama of Biyah. So therefore we see that there's a dimension lower than Atzilus, but the Kav is coming there together with the kelim of Malchus of Atzilus. And this is calling Adnai. Elokim is how Malchus is pre the partition, pre this stage. And there Malchus unites with Zoh in the levels we spoke about. But now Havaya Adnai, when you talk about Biti, that Malchus is like a daughter, the lower level of the Yichud, then it's referring to Malchus like the reflection of the Kav as it comes down with the Malchus, with the Kelim of Malchus of Atzilus. Oi, and here's a second way he explains it. That this level of Havaya Adnai, Havaya radiating in Adnai, what is Adnai? Oi, it's referring to the Nekudas HaMalchus itself. It's referring to the point of Malchus itself, Nekudas HaMalchus Atzilus, Shebekas Es HaMosach, V'yeredes Bereish HaBriya. So this is like a little lower level. The first interpretation is the reflection of the Kav that travels with the Kelim of Malchus of Atzilus. Now he's saying another way you could say Adnai is the Nekud of Malchus itself, just a point. As it pierces, now he uses the word Mosach, which really is another name for Parsa. They both mean partition or curtain, but it could mean Mosach is a lower level than Parsa. The fact that he's using two different expressions here, I'm not sure. V'yeredes and Malchus, this Nekuda descends Bereish HaBriya, the head of Briya, to the head of Briya. So why he's making these two different interpretations, I can't really answer that. The Rebbe Rashab obviously knows these levels like the back of his hand very clearly, but he's definitely saying that Adnai is either the reflection of the Kav as it travels pierces the curtain with the Kelim of Malchus of Atzilus, or is the Nekuda of Atzilus, which would mean it's not the Kav, it's the Nekuda of Atzilus as it pierces the curtain and descends and becomes the Reish HaBriya, Shezeu B'chinas Adnai. I'm assuming the reason he says it because the second interpretation makes it more connected to Malchus. It's more Malchusdik. It's Adnai. Whereas the first is more refers to the reflection of the Kav as it travels with Malchus. But I'm not sure the Havana, the understanding of the difference between these two, to be honest. I'd have to study it a bit more, but he definitely says an Oi. So there's two ways to understand this. Kenoida, as it's known. And what's known? That this is the level of Adnai. So this is lower than Havaya Elokim of Gan Eden, Vayita Havaya Elokim, because Elokim is talking about Malchus and Atzilus, and Adnai is talking about Malchus as it comes downward in both interpretations. And here the Rebbe Rashab now says, Ulamaila, Atzilus, and what level is this? Since he already placed the earlier level, Havaya Elokim, he said, was level number 6. Or the third level from the bottom of the top 4, which is where Malchus and Zah equal stature, but Malchus is still receiving Moichin through Zah, level 6. What about Havaya Adnai? What level would that be? So the Rebbe Rashab says, "Ulamayla ba'atzilus." And Atzilus, what level is Havaya Adnai? Yesh lemer shezeu hamabdrega habeisha beitzchaim sharmir tayireach. Daina kamoshi mechazei ulamata. If that was level 3, meaning level 6, this is level 5. What is level 5? He calls it level 2 because, again, he's talking about the 4 higher levels, and if we go from the bottom up, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. But really, it's like level 5. What is this? Like I explained, that's mechazei ulamata. There, it's not face-to-face. It's panim b'panim, it's face-to-face, but it's not standing with the same stature. Malchus is receiving from the chest and below, the lower spheres. Level 6, Havaya Elokim, so there Zoh and Malchus are the same, the king and queen, but the king's crown is still higher, and the queen or Malchus is receiving Moichin through Zoh, like he said, Al Yidei HaZoh. Now we're talking a level lower, Havaya Adnai, he says in Atzilus, here it's Malchus receiving face-to-face, yes, but from the chest and down, which means the lower spheres of Zah, not the higher level. So it's not standing equal stature. It would be like this, the chest. So Malchus connects more to the chest, which means, of course, it's not physically, this is spiritually. that it receives from the lower sphere, lower levels of Zah. That's what he says here now in the parentheses. So basically, we've identified levels 5 and 6. We're going to talk about 7 and we're going to talk about 8. I don't think he talks about the lower levels in Ayin Beis here, at least. Maybe some recollection I have that in volume 1. Volume 1, he may have spoken about it somewhat. I have to check it out. Okay. V'yashleimer. The Rebbe Rashab continues. And here is going to give a little more Havana, an understanding of what level we're talking about. Because just to state this before I read the next line, remember, these are not just technicalities. It's all about how much revelation of godliness is shining into the world. The lower levels of Malchus is the godliness is more concealed. The higher levels, the godliness is more revealed. So that's really what it comes down to, the 7 levels. So now we've spoken about the 2, which is Havaya Elokim and Havaya Adnai. So now he's going to explain what is this level. That this yichud, I believe he's talking about yichud Havaya Adnai, not yichud Havaya Elokim. Yeah. What does it mean in avoid? I guess what application do we have from that? He says this is the yichud, the union, the spiritual union, in order to create the worlds. Remember, we said Gan Eden is higher than the worlds. To create the worlds, you need more tzimtzum. That's why it only says Elokim, Elokim. But he's saying even the yichud Havaya Adnai is still all l'tzedach ha'ilimus, like he says, to creation of v'chein l'neshamas the biyah, and so too for the souls in biyah, not in Atzilus, in biyah, shenikraim avodim, that are called servants. If you may recall, when he spoke about daughter, sister, mother, so he said the daughter is like, the example was, you serve God like a servant. You're not a sar, you're not a minister that's on the equal stature and understanding the laws and developing them. You're just following halacha. You're following what you're told. He said that Eved, the level of avodim, is the neshamis of biyah, and also referring to avodim, and l'tzedach ha'elimus. So that's Havaya Adnai Malchus, as it's going down into biyah, or into bria. Or in Atzilus, it's Havaya Adnai only from the chazei and below. The union only with the chest and below. And that's the yichud that connects. That's in order for the worlds. Now we're going to go back in a moment to Gan Eden, but I just want to see one thing where he said this exactly with the neshamis. Neshamis the biyah. He said this. Where was it? Yeah, on top of page 1251, he spoke about this. The avodim and neshamis the biyah sheneldim yichud zun b'chinas yichud chitzeni lechadash haneshamis. And that's where he asked, aren't the Tanoim Amaroim neshamas of bria yitzira? So he said, no, the Tanoim Amaroim is like Atzilus in bria. Bria shenasa Atzilus. Atzilus shebebiyah. Yeah, but now we're talking about neshamas in bria, which is like the servants, like the daughter. Avol. But now going back to Gan Eden, the higher yichud of Havaya and Elokim, not Havaya and Adnai, who shemizen nailed him neshama shem b'chinas bonim. That yichud creates souls that are on the level of children, ub'chinas achim, and the level of brothers, siblings, v'reim and friends, equal stature to Zah. When you say Eved, you're referring to a lower level in the hierarchy. But the yichud of Havaya and Elokim in Gan Eden, that creates neshamas that are in the category of children, brothers, and friends. Shezeu b'chinas achesi. That's the level not of Biti, of the daughter, but of achesi, the sister. That's a sibling. Yes, he explained that the sibling could be a younger sibling to an older brother or older child, but it's still a sister on equal stature. Commission is barely ill, as was explained earlier, right? That earlier is right here on page, I was just reading, page 1250 and 1251. Yeah. Where actually he spoke about also the kav. If you remember the vov, so the vov is the kav. Yeah, but I remember that it's still receiving through Zah. It's not receiving directly from Moichin. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to stop here, but I'm going to stop for questions. Let's go for questions. I'm going to stop here. The next piece is the continuation of the pasuk that says, Atzei Hashem, Yizbu Atzei Hashem, that the trees of the Lord of Hashem should be filled, sated. So the next part of the pasuk says, and the birds that nest there. That's what we're going to learn. Ashesham Tziperim Yekananu. That they're there in those trees, the bird's nest. He's going to explain the bird's nest is this level of siblings. They nest in the trees of Havaya, which is Gan Eden on its own, that gives birth to the neshamas that are like siblings, not like servants. That's what is going to be the next section. But we're going to stop here. And any questions? No. Okay.
What you just mentioned, is that what's the last line that you just learned about bechinas yuchad Rabbi Elokim hu is that noldin neshamas shehem bechinas banim u bechinas achim. Banim and achim, are these two different levels? You're going to say that one is Gan Eden?
No, not necessarily.
Because
at this point, banim, achim, and reim, he says actually.
Yes. So
children,
banim is a different level.
Brothers and friends. Well, banim, the children are all siblings.
Banim is like banos. BT is a lower level than achim, I thought.
The brothers are siblings. So it's the level of siblings. We're talking about what you're giving birth to, not servants, but siblings that are equals. So banim and achim go together in that sense, that the children are siblings. Anyway, that's the general picture here. And friends, meaning equals. They're equal stature with Zoh.
Banim would seem to be on a lower level than achim.
Well, it's not. Banim means the children that are siblings. These children are siblings. He's not distinguishing. He says, you see it. He says it in one breath.
Okay.
Doesn't distinguish them here. Banim versus avodim. They're servants, they're children, which are siblings, and like friends, equals. Friends and children and siblings are not also exactly the same. But regarding this level of neshamas that we're talking about that are not servants, these three go into the same category. Maybe elsewhere he breaks it down, but not here. Okay. Any other questions? No, okay. So we'll stop here right before the words V'zehu, the next words. V'zehu shekasav. Like almost 3/4 of the way down on page 1256.